Hello everyone, this is Dr. Saburi again, and today we will talk about households in the context of development economics. So, as we have discussed previously, the unit of analysis in development economics is not the individual person, but the household, because the decisions of individual members in a household are interrelated and have to do with each other. One person earning a higher income, for example, increases that person's spouse's financial situation usually as well. The other way around, the spouse working at home allows the person who earns money to have higher income. Or if you think of a member of the household becoming sick, that has an impact on the economic situation of the entire family. And so on and so forth. So for those reasons, we take household as a unit of analysis, and in this chapter we take a closer look into households and analyze them. In the previous videos we have discussed how households make a consumption, time allocation, and production decisions simultaneously. So one thing to take into consideration is that as of now we consider the model static. So we ignore the future and we focus essentially on only one period of time. In the later chapter, we will look into a more dynamic model as well. First of all, we need to be aware that there are two types of households. We focus right now on the unitary household models. So there are two questions. What do we mean actually by unitary, and what do we mean exactly by household? Let's take a closer look into it. Essentially, with the unitary approach, what we mean is that we treat the household as a single decision-making entity. So in other words, there are no individual decisions or individual utilities, but only household decisions and only one utility function for the entire household. The household maximizes that unique utility function independent of prices of income, and we also assume the pooling of family incomes into one household income. So let's take a look into the well-being of the household. Again, keep in mind, well-being is not only about income, but income is of course one of the important determinants of well-being. So a household's well-being may be raised by increasing the endowments of the household, or by improving the prices that it faces in goods or labor markets. So what do we mean with that? What are endowments? Endowments can be all kind of capital, such as human capital or physical capital or technological assets, but also transfers. So if the family receives a basic income from the government, for example, to fight poverty, that's part of the endowment of the household. Or the other way to improve well-being of the household is improving the prices that it faces. So if the goods and services that a poor household, for example, purchases usually is now cheaper because of, for example, government subsidy, that has a positive effect on their well-being. As well as if you think of the labor market, if the household is a supplier of labor in the labor market and wages increase, that also has a positive effect on the household well-being. Also, we need to take into consideration the element of diversity. So households differ greatly in their endowments, but also they differ greatly in their relationships to the diverse markets. For example, while one household might be a supplier in the labor market, another household might be on the demand side of a labor market. If you think of a small family that has a farm, and during the harvesting season they need additional labor to help them out in the farm. Also, we have diversity in location, and if you think of a government program to improve the economic situation of the poor households, you also have diversity in whether or not they participate, how they participate, how much they profit from the government program. So while the one household might highly profit, another poor household might not profit so much, or they might not profit at all. So what we will look into today is how one policy tends to affect different groups of households in different ways. So how can we analyze it, and how can we try to predict how the different responses to changes of the different households are? Well, by building up the basic models of consumption, time allocation, and production all of which we have discussed in previous videos, we can develop that instinct about the ways households' choices might change in response to a policy change. So we will use all of those models that we have discussed previously to answer the question, what changes in parameters have the potential to raise well-being? What we have learned so far is that when fixed factors, technological assets, time endowments, human assets, or non-labor income endowments rise, we have an increase in well-being, as well as when prices for inputs or goods that are being consumed by the households fall, that also yields a higher well-being of the households. But things become a little bit more complicated if a household both consumes and produces a good. If we have a change here in wages or in prices of certain goods or commodities, the situation becomes a little bit more interesting. So we will look today into what is actually the net impact of those changes on the different households. So it's pretty safe to say that the household's well-being rises if the price of a good or labor it sells also rises, obviously, because that increases your income, and that the household's well-being falls if the price of a good or labor you buy falls, because that makes your purchases more expensive. So the analysis from here on will be based on these factors that I'm presenting to you here. So let's take a look. If the price of rice rises by rho percent, and M is the ratio of a household's net sales of rice to its total income, and every time we talk about total income, it can be also a ratio to total consumption expenditure, because our consumption expenditure is coming from my income, obviously, right? So in that case, the associated change in the household's total real income is approximately rho times M percent. So for example, if half of the income of a household is coming from the sales of rice, and rice prices increase by 10%, what it means is that the income of the household increases, roughly speaking, by 5%. So this is assuming, obviously, that the price increase in rice doesn't have any influence on prices of other goods and services. As you know, some goods are more essential. If you think of oil, an increase in price of oil tends to increase price of all the other goods and services, and a decrease yields lower prices of all other goods and services. So we are assuming that we don't have that influence, that the price change in that good that we are observing doesn't influence the prices of other goods and services in any significant manner. And also we are assuming that if the household is both producer and consumer of that good, that they do not change their own consumption of that good due to the price changes. So for example, if I have a little farm where I produce rice, part of the rice is consumed by the family and the rest is sold on the village market, we are ignoring the fact that the household might actually eat less rice as the rice price becomes more expensive, so that they have more rice available to sell on the village market. So we assume that their consumption pattern remains unchanged, change in price of rice. And accordingly, we assume that if the wage for a certain type of labor rises by pi%, and N is the ratio of the value of households' net sales of such labor to the total income, which again we assume to be the same thing as the consumption expenditure, then associated change in households' total real income is also approximately Greek P multiplied with N%, right? So it's essentially the same principle as in the previous case, just applied into the labor market. So let's take a closer look into the first sentence again. As I mentioned, let's assume price of rice increases by rho%, and M is the ratio of a household's net sales of rice to its total income. Then the associated change in the household's income is assumed to be rho times M. So let's do an example with numbers. We want to look into what happens to actually the household's real purchasing power if the household produces no rice, So they are only consuming rice, and the price of rice increases now by 30%. And actually, they spend 30% of their total consumption expenditure on rice only. Yeah, keep in mind again, we are looking here into a very poor household. So if the price of rice rises by 50%, by how much did actually the real purchasing power of the household decrease? Again, we are assuming here that a change in price of rice has no effect whatsoever on prices of other goods and services. So the first question is, does it increase or decrease the real purchasing power? It's pretty intuitive. We can figure out if they're only consuming rice, not producing it, and it becomes more expensive. Obviously, the real purchasing power decreases. Now, what is the net sales as a fraction of total consumption expenditure? They spend 30% of their income on rice. So by how much did the purchasing power decrease? All we need to do is multiply rho and m. So rho is the percentage of the expenditure that goes into rice, and m is the percentage that the price of rice has increased. So 50 times 0.3, and that is equal 15%. So the real purchasing power of the household has decreased by 15%. Again, this is a very, very simple analysis. We are not looking into the fact that the household might change their consumption behavior due to the price changes. So we have definitely also the substitution effect. It's not just the income effect of the price change of rice. Now, we are looking into another scenario. So this time, a household earns income only by selling a cash crop. What is a cash crop? Well, it's a crop that is produced for its commercial value rather than for use by the grower. So you just grow that only to sell. You do not consume it yourself in this case. They spend nothing on inputs and consume none of the cash crops. The price of the cash crop is now rises by 20%, and we are also assuming that the household has no other income than this cash crop that they are growing. So obviously here the real purchase power of the household increases. The cash crop sales is 100% of the total income of that household. That's why you see here the 1, and the percentage effect on real purchase power is 20% times 1, which is a 20% effect on real purchasing power. So far so easy. Let's take a look into a more interesting case. Now we're looking into a household that is both producer and consumer of corn, and to be more accurate, 80% of the income of that household is coming from selling corn, and 30% of the consumption of that household is actually the corn that they are producing. If the price of corn now rises by 40%, what happens here? Does the purchasing power of that household increase or decrease? Let's break down what is the net corn sales as a fraction of total income. So the net corn sale is, well, 80% of the income is coming from corn, but at the same time 30% of their expenditure is corn. So 80% minus the 30%, the net effect is 50%. As the net effect, 50% of their income is coming from corn. Accordingly, an increase of price of corn by 40% yields 40% times 50% equals a 20% effect on real purchasing power of the household. Now let's take a look at an example on the labor market. So if the wage for a certain type of labor rises by pi%, then the change in household's total real income is approximately pi times n, as we mentioned before, and n was a ratio of the value of the household's net sales of such labor. So here's an example. If a wage labor household earns 90% of its income from wage labor, and the wages rise by 20%, does it increase or decrease real income? Obviously it increases the income as wages go up, assuming that everything else is constant. Of course, nothing else changes, only wages go up. And net labor income as a fraction of total income is obviously 90%, which we can express as 0.9. So the percentual change in real income is accordingly that 20% multiplied with 0.9, which is 18%. So that's already it for this part of our analysis of households, and I would like to thank you for your attention.